Most people do not lose money on cars because they chose the wrong brand. They lose money because they judged the decision with the wrong lens. They looked at the sticker price and thought they were evaluating a machine. They were not. They were choosing a cash flow system, a depreciation system, a borrowing system, and, if they were not careful, an identity system. And once I learned to see those four systems clearly, I stopped asking the lazy question that traps most households. I stopped asking, should I buy or lease? I started asking, which choice gives me the lowest lifetime cost for the life I actually live? That sounds simple. It is not simple. It is brutally uncommon. The car business is built on making monthly payments feel smaller than total consequences. Human nature is built on helping that illusion along. We want the newer dashboard, the smoother smell, the comfort of a warranty, the social signal of arriving in something fresh, and the emotional anesthesia of breaking a large number into a smaller monthly one. When those forces combine, people call a costly decision reasonable simply because it has been spread over time. I have spent most of my life watching people confuse affordability with wisdom. A thing can fit inside your month and still destroy your decade. That is the real subject here. If you are buying or leasing a car in 2026, the listed price is not the true price. The monthly payment is not the true payment. The contract is not the true contract. The real contract is the one between your present appetite and your future wealth. And whether you build wealth or quietly bleed it away will depend on whether you can see through a handful of mechanisms that the average buyer never bothers to calculate. So let me give you the mother line first. A car is not expensive because of what you pay to get into it. A car becomes expensive because of what it keeps taking from you while you are trying to live your life. That is the whole game. And once you understand that game, you stop being impressed by low monthly numbers and you start behaving like an owner of capital. To make this concrete, let me use the kind of example ordinary families actually face. Take a vehicle priced around $39,900, roughly the range used in the reference example, well below the average new car price that is pushed up toward the $50,000 area in 2026. In other words, this is not some absurd luxury toy. This is exactly the kind of reasonable purchase people make while telling themselves they are being prudent. Fay filicite fay turn, one file zero fay. Now suppose a buyer puts 20% down, about $7,980, finances the rest for 72 months at roughly 6.51%, and ends up with a monthly payment around $537 over 6 years. That loan alone costs about $38,664, and roughly $6,744 of that is interest. Then you layer on insurance over 6 years, around $8,640 fuel, roughly $11,880 maintenance, roughly $7,272. Add those together, and before resale, you have laid out about $74,436. If the vehicle holds value unusually well and can still be sold for about $27,403 after 6 years, your net 6-year ownership cost lands near $47,033, or roughly $7,839 a year. That is the good case. Fay filicite fay turn, one file zero fay. Most people look at that and say, well, the car was under $40,000, and over 6 years I only spent a bit more than that net of resale. Not great, but manageable. Number, that is not the right reaction. The right reaction is to notice how effortlessly a purchase advertised one way becomes a life. Cost reality measured another way. The machine did not cost you the sticker. It cost you the sticker plus financing plus insurance plus maintenance plus fuel minus whatever discipline or luck you had in resale. If the resale value is worse, and for many vehicles it is, your result gets uglier very fast. In the example itself, if residual value falls from the strong case of 68% to something closer to 47%, the 6-year ownership cost jumps above $55,500. That is about 40% higher than the original new car price. Fay filicite fay turn, one file zero fay. That is why I call the first mechanism the sticker illusion. The sticker illusion is the oldest trick in consumer finance. It persuades you to evaluate a depreciating asset by its entry price instead of by its extraction rate. But wealth is never built by admiring entry prices. Wealth is built by controlling extraction rates. Every year, the car extracts cash from you. Some of that extraction is obvious. Some of it is hidden inside financing. Some is hidden inside the simple fact that a car loses value while you are congratulating yourself for getting approved. You cannot become intelligent about cars until you stop asking what it costs to buy and start asking what it costs to keep. The second mechanism is what I call the monthly payment sedation. This one is more dangerous because it feels so reasonable. People say, I can handle $537 a month. That is the voice of sedation, not analysis. A monthly payment is a painkiller. It reduces the emotional sting of a large price by slicing it into smaller pieces. But slicing a number does not reduce the economic reality of the number. It only changes your emotional response to it. A family that would recoil from seeing the full 6-year outlay in a single line will calmly accept it when it appears as a neat monthly drip. The pain is lowered, the cost is not, and that is how households drift. Not through one dramatic act of stupidity, but through years of well-packaged convenience. The car industry understands this. Banks understand this. Dealers understand this. They know that if they can get your attention away from total lifetime cost and onto the monthly line, most of the battle is over. Human beings are creatures of immediate perception. We feel monthly obligations. We do not feel future depreciation. We remember the smooth showroom experience. We do not remember the compound drag of 6 years of money that could have been allocated somewhere else. That is why people sign contracts that look manageable and then spend years wondering why they still feel financially crowded. Now let us move to leasing, because this is where even intelligent people become sloppy. Leasing looks cleaner, it looks lighter, it looks modern. You put less down up front. Your monthly payment is often lower. You get a newer vehicle. Basic maintenance is usually not the headache it would be with an older owned vehicle. The car goes back. The next one comes in, it feels efficient, but what is really happening? You are renting depreciation. That is the phrase that matters. The dealer expects the vehicle to lose a certain amount of value over the lease term. You pay for that loss, plus the financing charge embedded in the deal, plus fees and taxes, and then at the end, the dealer gets the asset back. In the 6-year comparison from the source material, assuming 2-3-year leases, roughly $3,750 due at signing each time, for a total of $7,500. Plus monthly lease payments near $450 over 72 months, totaling about $32,400. Plus insurance and fuel comparable to ownership, the 6-year total cost comes to roughly $60,420, or about $10,070 a year. And unlike the buyer, the lessee ends with no residual asset at all. Fay file site Fay turn 1 file 0 Fay, that difference matters more than people think, because the third mechanism is the residual value divide. If you buy a vehicle that holds value well, you are not merely driving it, you are preserving part of your exit when you sell. The residual value comes back to you. That value is not magic. It is simply the part of the economic life of the car that you did not consume. But in leasing, that future value belongs to someone else by design. You funded the consumption period. You do not participate in the residual. That is why in the 6-year example, buying can save roughly $13,386 compared with leasing the same class of vehicle over the same broad window. Not because buying is always romantic and leasing is always foolish, but because a well-chosen owned vehicle lets you recover some of the economic life you paid for. Fay Felicite Fay turn 1 file 0 Fay. This is where the identity flip must happen. The average consumer thinks like a driver. The wealthier consumer thinks like a capital allocator. A driver asks, what gets me into the car I want with the least monthly pain? A capital allocator asks, how much of my future earning power am I setting on fire to create this transportation experience? That single mental shift can change your lifetime finances, and it is especially important because there are circumstances where leasing is not crazy at all. If you only plan to keep the vehicle for 3 years, the answer becomes far more sensitive to depreciation. In the example, buying still wins for a strong resale vehicle after 3 years. With the residual value around 81%, the owned vehicle's actual holding cost works out around $24,765, or roughly $8,255 a year, while the 3-year lease comparison is around $30,210, or about $10,000 a year. So buying still comes out ahead in that particular case, but the margin narrows sharply, and if you swap in a faster depreciating vehicle whose 3-year residual is closer to 60%, leasing can actually come out around $2,900 cheaper over that shorter horizon. Faithful Essite Fay Turn 1 File 0 Fay read that carefully, because this is where lazy ideology ruins decision. Making the right answer is not buying is always better. The right answer is buying is usually better when you choose durability, retain value, keep the car longer, and do not let ego contaminate the purchase. That is a very different claim. It leads us to the fourth mechanism, which I call the time horizon trap. A car decision cannot be separated from how long you will actually keep the thing. If you behave like a serial changer, constantly refreshing every 3 years because you are bored, want the newest technology, or like the emotional lift of novelty, you are building a transportation system around consumption velocity. Consumption velocity is expensive. It forces you to live on the most painful portion of the depreciation curve. The first years are where much of the value disappears. If you rent that curve repeatedly or buy and sell inside it repeatedly, you are volunteering to absorb the most expensive stretch again and again. That is not transportation. That is a lifestyle tax. The great secret in cars, which is not really secret at all, is that the longer you keep a dependable vehicle, the more the annualized cost collapses. Once the loan is gone and the machine still functions, the economics can become almost beautiful. The monthly payment that once oppressed you disappears. The asset may be older, but the utility remains, and for a household that cares about wealth, utility is the religion, not novelty. I have always believed that many people underestimate the financial force of boring decisions repeated over a long time. A boring, durable car held for 10 or 12 years can do more for household compounding than 100 hours spent trying to optimize minor expenses while resetting the car clock every few years. That is because the fifth mechanism is not mechanical at all. It is human. I call it the image tax. The image tax is the amount of money people spend to manage how they appear to others. Sometimes that tax is ridiculous. Sometimes it is rational. If your work genuinely depends on appearance, if you are in a field where clients infer competence from presentation, if a newer vehicle is part of revenue generation, then the cost may be a business expense in a real sense, not just an emotional indulgence. The source material mentions exactly that kind of case, professions such as real estate sales or consulting, where image can influence outcomes. It also notes that certain business users may gain tax advantages from leasing. Those exceptions are real, faithful Essite, Fay Turn, 1 File 0 Fay, but most people are not making a business investment. They are making a self-soothing purchase and dressing it in professional language. They say they need reliability when they really mean they want status without guilt. They say they deserve something nice when what they really want is a fresh identity every few years. They say they do not want maintenance surprises, when often the deeper truth is that they do not want to be seen driving an older car after they have become accustomed to being the kind of person who always has something new. This is where financial decisions stop being spreadsheets and become mirrors, because the car is never just the car. It becomes a statement. And the question is whether that statement is being financed out of surplus or out of future compounding. There is a huge difference between the two. Now let me show you the trap that crushes high mileage drivers, because this is where leasing can become absurdly expensive while still looking elegant on the front end. Standard leases tend to come with mileage limits around 10,000 or 12,000 miles a year. Go over them, and the excess is often charged somewhere in the range of 15 to 25 cents a mile. Suppose you drive 18,000 miles annually. That means you are 6,000 miles over each year. At 25 cents per excess mile, you are looking at about $1,500 a year in penalties or roughly $4,500 over a 3-year lease. Over 2 lease terms, that becomes about $9,000 on top of the original cost. Fay Felicite Fay Turn 150 Fay. This is the 6th mechanism, the convenience penalty switch. At the front of the lease, you are sold simplicity. At the back of the lease, you may get punished for using the asset too much. That is a terrible arrangement for anyone whose life is dynamic, whose commute is large, whose family travels heavily, or whose work puts serious miles on the odometer. In that case, leasing is not merely somewhat more expensive. It can become a financial own, goal disguised as convenience. What makes this mechanism especially costly is that the kind of person most attracted to the neatness of a lease often also values mobility, flexibility, and active living. In other words, the very user who likes the product most may be the one most likely to violate the economics of it. That happens all the time in finance. People choose products that flatter their preferences rather than products that fit their patterns, and then they are shocked when the penalties appear. Now, there is another part of this conversation people handle badly, and that is interest rates. If borrowing costs fall, buying becomes more attractive if they rise. The edge narrows in the example. If the loan rate falls from about 6.51% toward 4.5%, the monthly payment drops by about $30, and total savings over the loan term are around $2,160. If the rate rises toward 8.5%, the monthly payment climbs to around $571. And although ownership may still win for a strong resale vehicle, the advantage shrinks. Fay Felicite Fay Turn 150 Fay. I call this the rate fog. People love to talk about rates because rates sound sophisticated, but rate talk can distract you from the deeper truth. Yes, the rate matters. No, the rate is not the whole game. If you choose a terrible car, hold it too briefly, overpay for features, and let ego run the selection, a slightly lower rate will not save you. And if you choose a durable model, put yourself on a shorter leash in terms of term length and keep it for years after the loan is dead. Even a higher rate may not destroy the economics. This is an important point because households often use interest rate changes as an excuse to avoid confronting their own behavior. They say, "I am waiting for rates," or "rates are why this deal is difficult," when often the bigger culprit is simply that the underlying decision is too expensive for the life they live. You do not solve a discipline problem with better financing. You solve it with better judgment. Now let me tell you where I personally come down, because on matters like this, I prefer clarity to fashionable ambiguity. My default is simple. If I can comfortably pay cash for a dependable vehicle without damaging liquidity I truly need, I prefer that route. I know the argument that one can finance the car and invest the difference. In theory, that can be defended. In practice, many people do not actually invest the difference with discipline. They spend it, or they invest it with the emotional instability that causes them to bail out at the wrong time, or they underestimate the psychic value of owning the car cleanly and having no lender attached to the machine sitting in their driveway. At borrowing costs around the mid-6% range, the arithmetic benefit of financing and investing the rest is not so overwhelming that I feel compelled to complicate my life for it. That is especially true for ordinary households, where simplicity has its own return. Fay Felicite Fay Turn 150 Fay, but if I were financing, I would follow a strict protocol. And this is where the story must become useful, because information without protocol is entertainment. Here is the operating system I would use. First, I would choose reliability over excitement. Second, I would choose resale strength over showroom drama. Third, I would choose the shortest loan term I could honestly afford, not the longest term that made the payment feel cozy. Fourth, I would assume the car needs to stay with me far longer than the social script suggests. Fifth, when the loan ended, I would not celebrate by increasing lifestyle. I would redirect the old monthly payment into investment immediately. That fifth step is where a car decision turns into a wealth decision. Think about what happens in most households. The car gets paid off. A few months of relief pass, then the family absorbs the freed cash into daily life. Better dining, more subscriptions, nicer small conveniences, the payment disappears, but no asset is built in its place. In effect, the family has completed years of forced saving into a depreciating machine, and then, when the burden lifts, they fail to convert the cash flow into compounding capital. That is an enormous mistake because the payoff point is the hinge. It is the moment when transportation can stop extracting and start funding. If you have been paying $537 a month and the loan dies, that is not found money. That is investment capital that has been released from a machine. Treating it any other way is how people remain perpetually car, rich in asset. Poor, this is why I say the true choice is not buy versus lease. The true choice is whether your car will remain a consumption event or become part of a broader compounding system. Once you see it that way, many fashionable arguments lose their power. The claim, "I want the newest technology every 3 years," becomes translated into plain English. I am willing to keep resetting my most expensive transportation years because novelty matters to me. That may be an honest preference, but then call it what it is. The claim, "I like leasing because the payment is lower," becomes translated honestly. I value short-term payment appearance more than long-term asset retention. Again, that may be acceptable, but be honest. The claim, "I will just trade in and upgrade later," often means, in practice, I intend to remain inside the dealer's economic machine indefinitely. That is a dangerous place to build a life from, because when you normalize recurring extraction, you lose the ability to feel it. And that, more than any one contract, is how financial mediocrity becomes permanent. What I want for the ordinary person is not that they worship cars less. I want them to see clearly enough that the car stops being a silent saboteur of future freedom. A dependable vehicle can be one of the most useful tools in a household. A constantly refreshed vehicle habit can become a beautiful prison. One gets you to work. The other rents you a story about yourself, and if you are not careful, you will pay tens of thousands of dollars for that story while telling yourself you are just making a transportation choice. Let us go one layer deeper, because this is where people who think they are good with money still get hurt. They compare buy and lease as if the goal were simply to identify the cheaper column. That is too shallow. The real goal is to understand which arrangement fits your behavior without requiring future perfection. If a lease only works economically as long as you stay under mileage caps, never crave extra features, never roll from contract to contract thoughtlessly, and never underestimate the appeal of always having a new car, then the lease requires a lot of behavioral discipline from a person already choosing convenience. That is a weak setup. If ownership only works as long as you choose a vehicle with strong durability, avoid vanity upgrades, maintain it sensibly, and keep it long enough to let the economics mature, then ownership also requires discipline. But the difference is this: the discipline of ownership tends to reward you more as time passes. The discipline of leasing usually just prevents extra damage. That is a profound distinction. One path offers upside from patience. The other mostly limits downside from drift. And since most human beings drift, I prefer systems that reward patience rather than systems that merely punish excess. There is also a moral comfort in ownership that people rarely discuss in financial language. When you own a dependable car outright, the machine becomes quieter in your mind. It is no longer a monthly negotiation with a lender or a ticking return date with a lease company. It simply does its job. That reduction in mental noise has value. It is difficult to measure on a spreadsheet, but anyone who has lived both ways understands it. This is particularly true in unstable times. If incomes wobble, if business slows, if the economy turns, if markets become unfriendly, the household with the paid-off reliable vehicle is standing on firmer ground than the household committed to the endless refresh cycle. Security is not glamorous until conditions become hostile, then it becomes priceless. That is why I have always preferred financial structures that remain sound when life stops cooperating. A decision is not wise because it works in the smooth case. It is wise because it still works when things get rough. Viewed that way, the dependable bought and kept car is not merely a transportation solution, it is a resilience asset. And resilience assets do not get enough respect in modern consumer culture because they do not sparkle. They simply save people. Now, I want to be fair. There are absolutely people for whom leasing is rational. Business deduction benefits can matter. Rapid model turnover may matter if specific technology changes are central to the use case. Some drivers value never being out of warranty, and they knowingly accept the premium for that certainty. Some people are emotionally happier leasing, and they have the income to support the preference without harming other goals. Fine, I do not object to preference funded from genuine surplus. What I object to is confusion. What I object to is the household that leases because it feels cheaper, finances identity with future cash flow, drives too many miles, rolls into the next contract automatically, never builds replacement assets, and then wonders why net worth feels stubbornly thin after a decade of decent income. That household did not have a car problem. It had a systems problem, and systems problems require contracts, not moods. So let me give you the contract I would want you to sign with yourself. If you need image for income and can prove it with numbers, then pay the image tax consciously. If you truly love novelty and are wealthy enough that the premium is harmless, then admit you are purchasing pleasure, not making the superior financial move. If you drive unusually high mileage, do not touch a lease unless you enjoy writing checks for avoidable penalties. If you finance, do not choose a long term to flatter your monthly ego. Choose a term that forces seriousness. If you buy, choose a vehicle whose reputation for reliability and resale is part of the thesis, not an afterthought. If you ever pay off a loan, redirect the old payment into investment before lifestyle can swallow it. And above all, never evaluate a car by the monthly payment alone. That last rule is the one I wish could be carved into every dealership desk in America, because the monthly payment is where rational people go to sleep, and sleep is expensive. The families that get ahead are not necessarily the ones with the highest incomes. Very often they are simply the ones that refuse to be anesthetized by financing language. They stay awake long enough to ask the awkward question, what will this thing actually cost me across the years I live with it? That question has no glamour, but it has power. And power is what you need if you want your financial life to become more than a long sequence of polished straps. In the end, the car decision is not a referendum on whether you are practical or stylish, rich or struggling, cautious or bold. It is a referendum on what kind of person is in charge. Is it the person who wants a smoother month? Or is it the person who wants a stronger decade that is the final threshold? Because one of these people will spend years renting appearances, resetting depreciation, paying for convenience, and calling it flexibility. The other will choose utility, keep the machine beyond the fashionable window, and quietly redirect what used to be a payment into assets that do not rust in the driveway. One person will always feel like a driver, the other will eventually feel like an owner, not just of a car, of his cash flow, of his choices, of his future. And if you want the harsh version, here it is. Most people do not get poor because they made one catastrophic decision. They get quietly weakened by 1,000 respectable ones. A car can be one of them. So before you sign anything in 2026, do not ask which option sounds modern. Do not ask which showroom experience feels good. Do not ask which monthly number hurts less. Ask the only question that matters. When this decision has lived with me for years, will it have made me stronger or softer? That is the regret mirror. And if you answer it honestly, the right choice will usually become embarrassingly clear.